You are not my real son. Michael is my only true son. My father's voice cut across the crowded hall, bouncing off the walls of the American Legion post, where 3 generations of our family and half the town had gathered for what was supposed to be a celebration of his retirement. His words ringing like a gavel slamming down on my chest, followed by a sharp intake of shocked breaths from old neighbors, cousins, and men I had worked alongside in the town mill before I left to build a life elsewhere. Their murmurs carrying that mixture of disbelief and eagerness that comes when people sense they're witnessing a scandal worth retelling. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I stood frozen, glass of bourbon halfway to my lips, while my younger brother Michael, the golden child who never kept a steady job past the season, who still slept in the same room where our mother had read him bedtime stories, leaned back in his chair with that smug tilt of his chin that told me this moment had been rehearsed, orchestrated, engineered to hurt me in a way only family can, and while I felt my ears burn red, I kept my face flat. Because I've learned that the first man to show anger in a room is the one who loses, and because I had a secret advantage tucked away that nobody in that hall, not my father, not Michael, not even my estranged ex-wife who had shown up out of some twisted loyalty to the family that despised me, would ever suspect, though I'd only reveal it when the time was right. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 38 years old, and I was born and raised in Greenville, South Carolina, on a stretch of road where summers smelled of cut grass and diesel from passing trucks, and where autumn brought bonfires that marked the start of high school football season. And though I'd left at 22 with nothing but a duffel bag and a refusal to be another Carter man who wasted his life in that mill, I never stopped sending money home through college, through my early years climbing the brutal ladder of finance in Atlanta, and now as a managing partner at a firm where my annual bonus eclipsed what most of those men in the hall would earn in a decade. I had quietly carried my family on my back, paying off my father's mortgage when the bank was ready to foreclose, covering Michael's endless debts from failed car lots and half-baked bars, even wiring money to my sister when her marriage crumbled, and she needed to keep her kids fed. Yet here I stood, stripped bare in front of them all, my father declaring me an outsider, an intruder, a stranger, as if years of sacrifice could be erased with one cruel sentence. And I thought of the small silver compass he had given me on my 12th birthday, engraved with the words, "Never lose your way," a trinket I had carried through every stage of my journey, a symbol that once meant guidance, direction, love, and in that instant it felt like nothing more than a lie, but something inside me whispered that maybe, just maybe, that compass would guide me again, not to him but away from him, and toward something colder, sharper, final. My eyes drifted to Michael, who soaked up the whispers of sympathy like sunshine, his hand resting possessively on the manila folder I suddenly recognized as the deed to the family home, the same house I had paid property taxes on for years, and I realized this was more than humiliation. It was a transfer of power, a coronation dressed up as a retirement party. And the town would remember it, not as the night my father stepped down, but as the night he chose his heir, his only real son. The bourbon in my throat turned bitter, but I swallowed it down, thinking of the years of phone calls I had answered past midnight to bail Michael out of another DUA, the holidays I had skipped board meetings to drive back and sit at that same kitchen table pretending we were a family, and I knew now that all of it, the money, the loyalty, the sacrifices, had been nothing but fodder for their private joke. Because the truth was, they had always wanted me broken, humbled, punished for daring to rise above the fate they believed was mine. The humiliation should have left me crippled, but instead it clarified something. I was done feeding them. I was done carrying them. And if they thought they had beaten me tonight, they had no idea that the quiet man standing with bourbon in his hand had already set in motion a plan that would turn every one of their greedy grasps into shackles they forged for themselves. I raised my glass, forced a smile that didn't touch my eyes, and toasted my father and his only true son. While inside me a vow crystallized. I would reclaim every ounce of dignity they had tried to strip from me, and I would make them pay in the only currency they understood: loss, legacy, and the slow, humiliating collapse of everything they thought was theirs. The toast left my lips like ash, and while the crowd half-heartedly clapped for my father and Michael, I lowered my glass and watched the room splinter into groups whispering, their faces tilted toward me, but eyes quickly darting away when I met them, because no one wanted to be seen comforting the son who had just been cast out. That's how small towns work. loyalty bending with public declaration, and I felt every stare like a splinter under the skin, but I forced myself to walk calmly toward the bar, shake hands, exchange stiff smiles, as if I hadn't just been gutted by my own blood, because letting them see me unravel would have been a second victory I refused to give them. On the drive back to my hotel, headlights cutting through the dark Carolina pines, my phone buzzed with messages from old friends and distant relatives, half apologies, half gossip-seeking probes, and I ignored them all, gripping the wheel tighter, replaying the moment in my head until the anger turned into something cold and deliberate. By the time I slid the key card into my room, I already knew what I had to do. Disappear into weakness. Let them believe they had destroyed me, because only by playing the broken man could I open the door for the real plan I had buried years ago. The one ace I had always carried in my pocket for the day my family's greed finally bared its teeth. I spent the following weeks in Greenville, pretending to lick my wounds walking Main Street with slumped shoulders, nursing beers at Mac's Diner where old high school classmates could see me and whisper about how far I'd fallen, even allowing Michael to lend me money one night in front of his buddies at the VF. So the story could spread that Daniel Carter, the once successful financier, had finally burned out and come crawling home. They laughed at me, openly, the way hyenas laugh at a carcass, and I let them, because every chuckle, every pitying glance, every whispered, I knew he wouldn't last, only tightened the mask I wore, while underneath I watched, listened, collected. My father had signed over the house to Michael, but what they didn't realize was that the taxes, the liens, the old business entanglements I had quietly managed for years were threads woven straight into my name, and unraveling them without me would be like trying to walk blindfolded through a minefield. I sat in the courthouse archive room for hours, the musty smell of paper and dust mixing with the faint hum of fluorescent lights, reviewing every deed, every tax payment, every title change connected to Carter property. While in public, I appeared to be wasting my days sulking. I made sure Michael caught sight of me once at a pawn shop, holding the silver compass like I was considering trading it for cash, and the smirk that spread across his face told me he thought he had finally won, that his big brother, the one who had escaped, was just another washed-up Carter ready to drown in debt and shame. That was exactly what I wanted him to believe. Meanwhile, my ex-wife, Rebecca, who had always carried a quiet disdain for my family but never missed a chance to align herself with whoever seemed most powerful, began showing up at the house for dinners with Michael, and soon the rumors trickled back to me, how the two of them had grown close. How my father looked at Rebecca with approval, how Michael bragged in the bar about finally taking everything Daniel ever had. The sting should have been unbearable, but instead it lit a fuse. I had spent years underestimating their malice, but now I saw it clearly. They didn't just want money, they wanted me diminished, humiliated, erased. So I leaned into their narrative, let the whispers of my downfall grow louder, even allowed Rebecca to see me drunk and slouched on a bar stool one night, her smug smile sliding across the room like oil on water, because I knew the deeper they believed in my collapse, the more reckless they would become. Weeks passed and Michael began flashing cash around town, buying a new truck, talking about turning the family home into some kind of event venue, bragging that he and Rebecca were looking at beachfront property down in Charleston plans built on money he didn't have, money he believed was his by inheritance, but really money tied up in strings he didn't even know I had knotted. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. A letter addressed to me but delivered to the family house, a legal notice about a lien renewal tied to one of Michael's old debts I had once paid off under my own name, and when Michael waved it at me like a trophy, laughing in front of my father about how I'd finally run out of rope, I knew they had taken the bait. They believed I was trapped, drowning under the weight of old financial ghosts, when in truth I had been feeding them scraps of paper designed to lure them closer to the edge. But just as I savored the satisfaction of watching their arrogance grow, life reminded me that no plan survives without turbulence. Because 2 nights later, I came back to my hotel to find my car vandalized, tires slashed, windshield shattered, and a note tucked under the wipers in Rebecca's handwriting. "Stay down, Daniel. This isn't your fight anymore." For a moment, standing in the humid night air with glass crunching under my boots, I felt the old rage threaten to rip through my calm. Because it was one thing to be betrayed financially. Another thing entirely to have the woman I once loved sneering at my weakness and siding with my brother, but then the rage cooled, crystallized into something sharper. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the secret advantage I carried had nothing to do with money at all. I slid the compass out of my pocket, its silver face glinting under the streetlight, and I whispered to myself that soon it would point not to north, but to the reckoning that was coming. The night of the vandalism hardened something in me, and as I stared at the compass glinting in my hand, I decided the time for patient observation was over, though the mask of weakness would stay on until the trap fully closed, and so I doubled down on my performance of the broken man, spending mornings wandering the cracked sidewalks of Greenville with my shoulders stooped, afternoons sitting in diners with a single coffee going cold in front of me, and evenings nursing cheap beers at the Legion, where my father and Michael could hear the whispers of how far I'd fallen, because every lie they believed was another thread in the web I was weaving around them. My secret advantage wasn't money, though I had plenty of that, and it wasn't legal maneuvering, though I had quietly prepared those as well. It was knowledge. Years of watching, documenting, filing away the patterns of my family's dysfunction, the debts Michael had signed under aliases, the shell businesses he'd used to borrow money from small-town lenders, even the little fraud Rebecca had committed when she doctored her finances during our divorce. All of it I had tucked away like ammunition, waiting for the day they forced me to use it. And now, with the humiliation public and my father's declaration echoing in the town's memory, the day had come. I began small, feeding subtle cues into conversations, letting words slip to the right people that Michael was sitting on cash, that he was careless with paperwork, and within weeks I heard that one of his old creditors had resurfaced, emboldened by the rumors, showing up at the family house demanding repayment, and Michael, cocky as ever, waved him off, saying, "My brother's the one who owes, not me," which only made the man angrier. I smiled when I heard it, because every denial Michael threw into the air was a rope tightening around his own neck, and I had only nudged it into motion. Meanwhile, Rebecca strutted around town with the entitlement of a woman who thought she had finally aligned herself with power, her laughter spilling too loud at restaurants, her hand clasping Michael's like a trophy, and though it cut to see her so smug, I let it fuel me because I knew that what she craved most was the illusion of control. And nothing would destroy her faster than having that illusion ripped from her grasp in front of everyone she sought to impress. The ticking clock came in the form of a county hearing. Michael, emboldened by my father's backing, had petitioned to transfer not just the house deed, but surrounding land, parcels my grandfather once farmed, and which I had quietly paid taxes on for 2 decades, into his sole ownership. And the hearing was scheduled for the end of the month at the courthouse where my humiliation had already become small-town legend. For weeks leading up to it, I played my role. Daniel Carter, the once successful son turned washed-up shadow, showing up late to hearings, looking rumpled, letting my voice crack when I spoke in public. While in private, I worked like a surgeon, filing motions, collecting sworn affidavits, gathering a paper trail so meticulously detailed it could crush a man twice as careful as Michael. I even visited the bank president, an old friend from high school who still remembered the night I lent him $500 to keep his truck from being repossessed, and I slid across the desk not just ledgers and debts but photographs, contracts, a map of Michael's dealings that looked like a spider's web with him at the center, and the man whistled low, saying, "You're about to bury your brother alive." I only smiled and told him it wasn't about burial, it was about truth. But truth is a slippery thing. And just when I felt the tide shifting in my favor, Michael landed another strike. My father, frail but still stubborn, stood outside the courthouse one morning and announced to the local paper that he was rewriting his will to cut me out entirely, leaving everything land, house, possessions to Michael, and the headline ran across town like wildfire. Local businessman chooses younger son as sole heir. My phone lit up with messages. Pity and mockery tangled together, and for a moment I felt that old sting, the one I'd carried since childhood, but then I looked again at the compass, rubbed the engraved words with my thumb, and reminded myself that north, no matter how many lies are spoken in public. That night I drove past the family house, slowing as I saw Rebecca and Michael on the porch, their laughter spilling into the humid summer air, and I thought of all the nights I had dreamed of building something there, of bringing my own children back one day to visit their grandparents, and I felt a flicker of grief, but grief hardened into resolve, because those dreams were dead, and all that remained was the reckoning. I parked on a back road, rolled down the window, and listened to the cicadas scream in the darkness as I rehearsed every step of the hearing in my head, every document, every reveal, every word that would pull the ground out from under them. When I finally turned the key in the ignition, I knew the noose was nearly closed, and all that was left was to watch them step into it of their own accord. The day of the county hearing broke heavy with summer heat, the kind that made shirts stick to your back and tempers run short, and as I walked up the courthouse steps, I could hear the low buzz of voices inside. Neighbors and townsfolk drawn not just by the legal matter, but by the spectacle of family tearing itself apart in public, and I felt their eyes follow me as though I were a man already condemned. Michael strutted at the front with Rebecca on his arm, his new truck parked illegally at the curb as though rules had never applied to him, while my father leaned on his cane and nodded gravely at those who offered congratulations, his face set in the righteous mask of a patriarch handing down justice. I kept my head low, shuffling in with a manila folder that looked worn and thin, as though I had little left to fight with, and when the hearing began, Michael's lawyer, a slick man in an ill-fitting suit, rose to argue that the deeds, the taxes, the property rights all belonged by legacy to Michael, the only true son, while I sat in silence, eyes down, fingers brushing against the silver compass in my pocket, feeling its weight like a talisman. When the judge finally called my name, I stood slowly, let the room take in my tired frame, my rumpled jacket, and then I placed the folder on the table and spoke in a calm voice that carried through the chamber. Your Honor, while my brother believes this land is his by blood, the law tells a different story. I opened the folder and began sliding papers one by one across the table, tax receipts spanning 20 years, all in my name, certified and notarized. Canceled checks showing I had paid off liens Michael had incurred when he failed to pay his creditors. Sworn statements from lenders he had defrauded under false signatures. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Rebecca stiffened beside Michael, and my father's jaw tightened as he shifted uncomfortably. I let the evidence pile higher, each page a stone added to the wall I was building around them, and then I produced the final piece. A trust agreement signed years earlier, naming me the financial custodian of all Carter family property in the event of delinquency, a document my father had once begged me to draft to save the house when Michael nearly lost it, a document he had long forgotten, but one that carried the weight of the law. The judge's brow furrowed, and in the silence that followed, I could feel the tide shift, but I wasn't finished. Not yet. I turned to the crowd, to my father, to Michael, and finally to Rebecca, and I said, for years I carried this family quietly. I paid every debt, every tax, every bill. I never asked for thanks, but I expected at least honesty. Instead, you tried to erase me. But you can't erase the truth, and you can't erase the paper trail. Gasps echoed as the judge ruled that the land, the house, and all associated assets were not Michael's but mine, secured under the trust and protected by years of documented payment. Michael's face twisted in disbelief. Rebecca's hand slipped from his, and my father's cane clattered to the floor as he slumped back in his seat, suddenly old and powerless. But that was only the first twist. Because when Michael lunged forward, shouting that I had set him up, that I was the fraud, I calmly pulled out a small flash drive from my pocket, slid it across the table to the bailiff, and said, perhaps the court would like to hear recordings of Michael and Rebecca discussing how to cut me out, how to forge documents in my absence, how to sell parcels of land already tied to unpaid liens. The bailiff handed it to the judge, who plugged it into the courtroom computer, and soon the room filled with the unmistakable sound of Rebecca's voice saying, don't worry, your dad will sign whatever you put in front of him, and once Daniel's gone, it's all ours, followed by Michael's drunken laughter. The effect was volcanic. People in the gallery gasped, whispered, shook their heads, while Rebecca turned pale and Michael shouted over the playback, his voice cracking with desperation. The judge slammed the gavel, demanding silence, and when order was restored, he declared the petition not only denied, but referred to the district attorney for possible criminal investigation. Michael's bravado crumbled into pleading. Rebecca tried to slink away but found every eye on her, and my father sat with his face in his hands, unable to meet mine. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver compass, held it up so only they could see, and whispered, you told me never to lose my way, looks like you're the ones who lost yours. The symbolism wasn't lost on the crowd. I saw it in the way their eyes followed the glint of the compass, in the way the story was already writing itself in their minds. The disowned son who came back with proof, who endured humiliation only to expose the truth. That was the second twist. They hadn't just lost the land and the money. They had lost the story, the narrative they had tried to build at my expense, and in a small town, losing the story is worse than losing wealth. By the time I walked out of the courthouse, the air heavy with cicadas and gossip, Michael was in handcuffs arguing with deputies, Rebecca was shouting that she had been tricked, and my father sat alone on the courthouse steps, staring at the ground like a man who had gambled everything and lost. I didn't gloat, didn't linger. I simply walked past, the compass warm in my palm, and when I reached my car, I allowed myself a long, slow breath. The poetic justice wasn't in their downfall, it was in my freedom. For the first time in my life, I owed them nothing. No money, no loyalty, no silence. They had tried to bury me in humiliation, but in the end, they buried themselves. And as I drove away, the sun cutting through the pines and the road stretching north, I realized the compass had been right all along. I had never lost my way, I had simply been waiting for the right moment to show them where it truly pointed. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.